The books that are labeled as former prophets or history portion of the Old Testament are primarily composed of narrative. They tell one more or less continuous story of the people of Israel as they enter, live in, lose, and are restored to the Promised Land. One of the key elements of this story is how the Israelites transition from a large family, the children of Israel, that is Jacob, to a glorious kingdom. In this lecture, we will focus on the way that God leads Israel from one to the other through four appointed offices: prophets, priests, judges, and kings. In the beginning, God dealt directly with Adam and Eve. When they were without sin, God was said to walk with them in the Garden of Eden. This fellowship was broken by the fall, and as a result, God distanced himself from communicating directly with mankind. He spoke to Noah and Abraham and Jacob, but as time progressed, he began to rely more and more on two offices in particular, the prophet and the priest. Prophets were primarily God's spokespersons. If God wanted to direct a person or a nation, he would send a prophet to speak on his behalf. Sometimes, people like Abraham were called prophets in the Bible because God spoke directly to them, and as a result, they could convey the will of God. Moses is considered the greatest of all the prophets in the Old Testament, even though he began his role reluctantly, and Elijah often receives honorable mention for leading Israel through the terrible reign of Ahab and Jezebel. Prophets play an important role throughout the Old Testament, and it's even thought that the prophet Samuel may have founded a school for prophets in the early days of the kingdom. In every era, the prophet may be thought of as a man or woman who represents God before the people. By contrast, the priest is someone who represents the people before God. The Bible depicts these as always being male, although God sometimes calls Israel a nation of priests, which has a more inclusive tone. The first priest mentioned in the Bible is Melchizedek, who received blessings and possessions from Abraham as an act of devotion to God. Eventually, Moses' brother Aaron would be set apart as the high priest of Israel, and his children would continue to bear this role even as the whole tribe of Levi were devoted to priestly service. In this role, priests would offer sacrifices that God required on behalf of the people, and played a key role in maintaining the nation's holiness before God. So prophets and priests provided leadership by revealing God's will to the people and presenting the people's sacrifices to God. In this way, by communication and purification, they formed the bedrock of God's relationship with his people. Once the Israelites are freed from Egypt, a third office appears, that of a judge. Even though Moses was primarily a prophet, he also functioned as the leader of a nation of Israel. People would go to him to settle disputes, and eventually he created a system of judges to help maintain justice in the land. Judges were not initially leaders in any broad or political or military sense. Instead, they were the elders who spoke wisdom into difficult situations. This system would work as long as the judges were upright and the people accepted their unbiased judgments. But after Moses died and the Israelites were settled in the Promised Land, the judge system proved to be too weak to maintain justice in Israel. Many judges became corrupt, taking bribes to sway their verdicts. What's more, the people repeatedly turned away to false gods and became corrupt themselves. But God also called on some judges to act as leaders to rescue Israel from oppressors. And this is the theme of the book of Judges. These judges often lead in battle or sometimes advise those who do. They ruled with a stronger hand than was typical, but once they died, Israel would fall away again. By the end of 1 Samuel, the people are fed up with the corrupt judges, including Samuel's own sons, who have not followed in his footsteps. They demand a king, so they can be like other nations. This is understood to be a rejection of God's direct kingship in favor of man who rules with a stronger hand and brings glory to the nation of Israel. But God allows this and sets up what is essentially a new form of judge, one who rules from a throne which passes to descendants, who always leads in battle, who acts as the final judge in disputes. The king is to establish peace and justice in the land. By connecting the kingship to the system of judges that came before it, we see why David was praised for his military victories and why Solomon was praised for his wisdom. They represented two sides of the best the system had hoped to offer. This also explains why Absalom was eager to take the role of judge as a way of undermining his father's authority. The king acts as final judge, as the instrument of God's justice in the land. A great deal of the history of Israel unfolds as the ministry of God's prophets, priests, judges, and kings. Ultimately, all of these offices point to Christ, who represents God before the people as spokesman, who represents the people before God as mediator, and who establishes justice as the great judge and final king. Jesus teaches what a prophet, priest, judge, and king should look like, and the record of prophets, priests, judges, and kings reveal why these offices are so crucial, and why ultimately they would have to be filled by God himself.